Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the code vein of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka Listen Mom. It's called Porno Grind, and it's art.
And I'm the black metal guy, aka that feeling when you haven't flossed for 2 months, but you floss and then it sort of pours out a torrent of blood.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's the whole flossing. Did you see that study recently that was like, oh, it
Feels
turns out
good, dude.
we don't actually have any evidence that flossing does anything, it just seems like a really good idea?
I haven't heard that study, no. I mean, I don't know. My dentist seems to think it does, but, who knows.
Look at this luxurious guy having a dentist and stuff.
Yeah, it's, I'm a lucky man.
Very false. You got health care and shit. It's like, nah, I don't do any of that. I get sick, I die like a real man. Oh shit. Oh. We got a weird batch of albums today. Weird show today. Dipping back into deeply uncool 2000s styles of metal, pretty consistently across the board.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we have any news today, so real quick, top of the hour. Social media. Follow us on it. Death Metal Guy on Facebook at Terminus Podcast, or the Black Metal Guy on Instagram at Terminus Extreme Metal. Feel free to tag us in all of your dankest memes. And additionally, as a side note, I'm your conscience. You've been listening to Terminus Extreme Metal Podcast for a little over a year now, and it's starting to wear on you the burden that these guys are providing such sick, hot takes on a weekly basis, and you're doing nothing to fund the war effort. Well, here's your opportunity. The best way to support us is by subscribing on Patreon or Subscribestar, where $3 and up gets you access to our Terminus Prime bonus episodes, and $5 and up gets you access to the Terminus Black Circle, where we talk about what kind of old 90s cartoons we want as tattoos, and argue about the merits of Scythian. Just kidding, there's nothing to argue, just everybody's listening to them now.
Oh, do you like Scythian now?
Well, a couple of guys in the Discord were talking about listening to Scythian now and getting really into it.
Oh, yes, it's happening.
It's happening. your fucking decade-long effort to make Scythian a thing is starting to take root.
Yeah. They had, I don't know, they had a brief moment of attention in 2009, maybe. And then turned out that... I suppose it turned out that historically accurate Indo-European battle metal wasn't what the European festival circuit was looking for.
All right, so you got first album today, and this is a Terminus first because, ladies and gentlemen, the Black Metal Guy has brought his first ever brutal death record onto the show.
Yeah, well, this just had a crazy-looking cover and absurdly aggressive title, and I thought, well, we have to cover this. So this the band is Blind Hate, and the record is Shinbe, Expulsion of Foreigners. That's coming out on Stakk Records, and nobody has even bothered putting the timestamps on our record of the English version yet.
Oh yeah.
So this is a very Japanese release.
This is deep cut Japanese music industry stuff, which I'll touch on a little bit when we cover the record.
All right, cool.
So for my first pick, we have the inaugural release by Gallows with 66 Black Wings, released on an imprint called Katafalque, which is almost certainly like one of the guys or a friend.
Yeah,
it's the first release of the label. Yeah, so brand new label. Playing old school 2000s style, old nowadays black metal, I guess. So, but that's a pretty fun one, and I think we both found a lot to like there. Oh, forgot we were doing the sandwich. All right, yeah, I'm up again, and we have the newest entry by notorious DSBM project Thy Light, with a new self-titled EP that is basically a full-length record. This is an independent release right now, although I believe that there is a a vinyl press in talks for a little bit down the road. Super long time fan of this band from the first demo tape, so very excited to see what he's doing now.
And finally, we are checking in with a band from Finland that I've had my eye on for a while, although I missed their last album for whatever reason. But a band called Hanging Garden, and the record is Skeleton Lake, out on Lifeforce Records. Difficult to characterize, although I think, as we'll talk about, it wouldn't have sounded as unusual 15 years ago. But basically it's in the vein of sort of gothic doom, gothic death doom or something, although it's gotten more towards the gothic part of it as on this record. All right, and we are kicking off a episode of Terminus, which of course is what we're doing, with Blind Hate's Shinbe, Expulsion of Foreigners on Rockstack Records. Took me a sec.
I am so proud of you, my large adult son. You've brought a brutal death record onto the show.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So so basically I absolutely picked this because the cover and title are sick. And I was like, clearly this is absolutely insane in the way that we at Terminus think is aesthetically valuable. This is, I mean, for those of you who are just listening, the cover is a sort of deezed demon samurai putting a gigantic sword through the eye of a Japanese, like an oni or big Japanese giant demon. And there are a bunch of crucified heads, presumably of foreigners, behind him, or heads on a, what is that even? It's a scaffold of heads.
Yeah, the heads are taking up where the top of the cross would be.
Yes, so very sick cover. Certainly a statement. And musically, I mean, you can see even from the cover imagery, you can get an idea that, okay, this is probably going to be brutal death metal that has some sort of a hardcore undertone, just from the general flavor of it, right? Mm-hmm. And you've also told me about the Japanese brutal death scene, and it has sounded to me like it's something that would be up my alley. So, basically, I just briefly clicked on it and was like, yeah, okay, this is brutal. Let's see what the death metal guy thinks of it. And then you gave it your stamp, and here we are.
Yeah, no, so yeah, we've talked about the Japanese scene a little bit here and there. I'm a big fan of the Japanese metal scene as a whole. And in particular, the Japanese brutal death scene has a long and enduring history. And one thing that's kind of a commonality between all the Japanese brutal death bands, be they more old school or more modern slam, is a direct connection back to New York death metal from the mid-90s, which is a scene that I think, after hearing this, you should absolutely be checking out, because everything that you like on this record is coming directly from New York circa 93 to 98. We're talking about bands like...
Yeah, you've told me about Internal Bleeding before. Yeah.
Yeah, Internal Bleeding, I think, is the biggest influence on this record. You're also going to hear Old Dying Fetus, like the first couple records, Dehumanized, and then if you wanted to go down the rabbit hole, you could check out bands like Repudiation or Scattered Remnants. Repudiation might be a little bit much for you, but you might appreciate the weirdness of it. So, and this style of New York death metal that is distinct from, say, like the Incantation or Immolation style is the fact that it's deeply, deeply connected with old New York and Boston hardcore, which you can hear in fits and starts on, the old Suffocation material, but comes out way stronger on some of these bands that are a little less known. And Blind Hate, these guys are directly pulling from that playbook. Which is not something you hear a whole lot anymore, which I thought was really interesting. And honestly, their execution of it is super strong.
Yeah, this is, like, in some sense it's weird. Like, when you bring a brutal death, a modern, like a your style of brutal death record on, I just get in this kind of mode where it's like, well, okay, I don't listen to this. Let's just see what there is to like here, and get in this kind of I try to sympathetically inhabit the brutal death worldview, right? Here, with something like this, it's close enough to things that I like that the brutal deathiness of it, like I can hear it getting like it's like it's not as immediate for me as you might think, right? This is still a brutal death metal record, I guess is what I mean, and like the way that it's organized around these kind of lurching, lower mid-tempo kind of chain of, you could say they're proto slams, but they work more like hardcore breakdowns. That and the sort of brick-walled production, it takes some getting used to, right? It's like, in a sense, it almost hits me more how unfamiliar this stuff is to me when it's closer in some ways to things that I listen to.
I can see that. Yeah, because you're used to brutal death being this like completely alien experience, and now you
and approximating sort of avant-garde forms of Black Death, kind of accidentally, right? Because it's so alienating, right?
Yeah, this is much closer to old school death metal in a lot of ways, and that whole scene of like New York brutal death is, it's interesting because it's like it's not brutal death. It's brutal death as a stylistic description of something distinct from death metal, but this is not necessarily way more extreme than old school death metal in the way that a lot of modern brutal death is.
Not really. No, it's more I guess it's more, in some ways it's more technical and I think it is more, it's remote from conventional ideas of death metal in a way that brutal death metal is, and it's more rooted in thrash riffing than in death metal trem riffing, which I think is also a feature of other brutal death stuff.
I would say that a lot of this whole style is built out of sort of thrash adjacent tremolo riffing combined with these sort of proto beatdown hardcore ideas.
Yeah. So basically, so it is, there was some barrier to entry for me. I think that is definitely really good. There's, in terms of just like cool riffing things to listen for, it's basically constant. And it does remind me of some of the earliest extreme metal I heard at all, which was, on a late night death and grind show back in the day. And going over and over again, it yields more. So one overall thought I had was they're doing something harmonically here where there's some sort of gestures to traditional Japanese music.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a distinct melodic idea that it bears some resemblance to stuff like old Internal Bleeding or Dying Fetus, but it's definitely made their own on this record.
Yeah, for sure. So that's cool. And, if you're more of a black metal person like me, that might be something that allows you to get your hooks in it, is that there are certain kinds of, there is this kind of rooted regional sound quality to it. There are some melodies that are going to sound more more samurai than Yakuza, maybe.
Yeah.
Especially towards the back end of the record. And I sampled one of those. But related to that, some of the interesting tonality, it's like, some of it is like, right, so if I had an overall way to characterize it, it's that this record sounds, it's not like it's really like that sort of weird major key thing that, say, you'd get like Cryptopsy going for, or in a different way a lot of modern bands. But there's something brighter about a lot of the kind of melodic ideas being used. And so part of that clearly is the Japanese folk thing. Part of it, like, it always reminds me of Blessed Are the Sick or something. But then I realized, well, I'm not a death metal guy. Every time I say something that sounds like every time I say, oh, this reminds me of Morbid Angel, and am I just saying this reminds me of 90s death metal that's not from Sweden?
Not necessarily. I think it's more the kinds of death metal records we like to bring on the show are like that. But also, of some of the early death metal bands, Morbid Angel has extended further into modern technique. Like, it feels like there's still people going back and picking up on nuances from Morbid Angel in a way that you just don't really see from a lot of the old US death metal.
So what I was wondering is, are those kind of brighter harmonies or whatever, are those like in Internal Bleeding? Like, because I know there are some weirdly bouncy things in Suffocation, right?
Yeah, you'll definitely, because I'll play you a little Internal Bleeding in a bit.
I'd like
some of those ideas. But additionally, that's also just a feature of Japanese death metal. Like, if you listen to some kind of classic Japanese brutal death bands, say like Vomit Remnants, or even modern kind of slammier stuff like Infernal Revulsion, you'll hear a lot of those same ideas.
Okay, word. All right, well, maybe we should get to the samples then.
Yeah, let's do it. So, like you said, a lot of this record is built around these sort of crawling, mid-paced, breakdown-ish arrangements that sort of form the bulk of verses on this record when they're not doing blasting. So here's a pretty cool section off of the second track, Torture Even a Dream.
This is for sure one of the best parts, and also one of the most hardcore.
Yeah, this is extremely hardcore, but also extremely death metal. As soon as I heard this, it's like, oh, you know, this could be like a dehumanized song from the mid-90s. So, let's do it. So you can hear there that it's very, you know, it's a sort of a hardcore arrangement, but then it's really stretched out in interesting ways through the death metal itself. You know, just for instance, the way that riff progresses, that simple like open string palm muted chug riff, that dun 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 dun, but then it breaks into that micro solo, and there's an actual melodic arc, even though it appears just to be a really cool simple breakdown at first blush. It's very smartly arranged music. Like, the first time you hear it, it can kind of blow past you, because it's like, well, you know, you're just kind of concentrating on, like, sick mosh riffs or, you know, a cool trem riff. But then you listen to it in aggregate, and you kind of imagine that you're supposed to be listening to this in, like, a dingy Japanese club way too loud, and it starts to come together a lot more, I think.
That sounds like a good setting to hear it. Also, the, even the mosh riffs, right? Like, they'll change from, I mean, you know, you'll get a series of different sort of breakdowns or beatdown passages in modern hardcore, right? Strung together, but usually it's like, okay, these ones are all in 4/4. Or like, these ones all have a quadruple feel, right? This band will change rhythmic ideas, whether that's like from 4 to 3 or something subtler than that, maybe just like different picking patterns within the same kind of time signature. They'll do a lot of rhythmic change-ups. They'll like come to the end of the main mosh part, and then they'll pull out a sort of different chug that answers it, that has a different rhythmic feel, and then they'll go back to the main mosh part a lot. And it's way more subtle compositionally. It's like,
No, definitely. Yeah, you also hear that a lot on the some of the blast passages where there's some stuff that almost feels like the band is stumbling, but then you realize, the guitar is kind of finding a different one against the drums. They're kind of chopping up riffs, like almost in the middle of riff sections in these very convoluted ways, but it always snaps together at the end of the phrase. But it's definitely very strange the first time you hear it. But yeah, after I heard that, as soon as I heard that passage, I was like, okay, the favorite band of Blind Hate is Internal Bleeding. And specifically, I'm thinking of arrangements from kind of it was their mid-period when I started listening to them as a kid, but now it's, old school. But specifically albums like Extinction of Benevolence and Driven to Conquer. So I've got a sample off the title track of Driven to Conquer, which is over the years slowly grown on me, and now it's like one of my favorite death metal albums of all time. Yeah. Oh, also, if you ever get a chance to see him live, absolutely do it. It's fucking crushing. So yeah, let's listen to Driven to Conquer, and you'll immediately hear the parallels between these two bands.
All right.
So can you hear the parallels between the ideas there?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so Internal Bleeding does stuff a little bit more straightforward than these guys because, this was the mid-90s or late 90s when Driven to Conquer was released. But there's a similar feel, especially, as we'll hear in later samples, in the tremolo riffs. Like the way Internal Bleeding does these kind of like racing, climbing tremolo riffs is kind of similar to a lot of the stuff that Blind Hate is doing. And obviously that whole sort of scattered verse section they have there where it's almost difficult to find the point to headbang. It kind of slithers all over the place. That's something you hear a lot on this record also, I think.
I saw in the YouTube comments that the drummer died. Did you know this like 4 years ago?
Oh yeah, no, that was a few years ago. That was actually a pretty tragic story. He was a
firefighter.
Yeah, he was a firefighter in New York, and he died fighting a fire. So yeah, props to him. I saw Internal Bleeding once with him, and then once after he passed, and that was a big impact on the band because he was there from the beginning.
And that is just what a quintessential like NYDM, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most important bands of that scene.
Yeah. It's but yeah, so yeah, that I hear the parallel there for sure. Also just like, the sort of weird flam passages at the end of the breakdowns that kind of dress them up in a way that a hardcore band would not. But that say Suffocation kind of would, right?
Certainly. Or that Blind Hate would. I mean, I've always felt like it was...
No, that's what I mean. Like, Blind Hate does that for sure, and you hear simpler versions of it in the Internal Bleeding.
I always feel like the whole style emerged from death metal guys hearing proto beatdown hardcore, loving the vibe, but just being physically unable to play that simply, you know?
I get that. Yeah. So cool. All right. Now we are going to sample... What? Yeah, okay, we're going to keep talking about slams.
Okay.
So we're going to the... Oh, yeah, we'll just do the title track. We've, as usual, if we both picked track samples from a track, it usually means that's one of the core ones, especially if they're both positive samples, and they are. So this is Expulsion of Foreigners, and we're going to start with this. A lot of things happen here, but this is just, we're going to start with this pretty cool kind of springy breakdown. But again, you can listen to the way that when they finish it, they sort of tie it off at the end in this sort of turnaround, or I think a thing this band uses a lot is codas. I had to look up what that meant to make sure I was using it right. But it's like, you know, like a musical phrase that ends a passage, like specifically finishes something. Like, you know, you're not, it's not just you have the riff and then you play 3 extra notes that make it end, right? There's like a new riff that ties off what you've been doing. And they do that, like, they do that all the time, but like, it's crazy that they do that with breakdowns. So listen for that. And that's a place where you get some of the Japanese harmonic color too. So yeah, Expulsion of Foreigners, crank it up.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on there.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think we've already sort of drawn attention to a lot of the salient features, right? You get the sort of, this is a place where we do get, like, time shifts within the beatdown, right? You know, also just general thought, like, that was, oh yeah, like, the really sick coda riff at the end tying off the whole passage, like the kind of faster, blasty one that just played, right? The cool thing, right, that doesn't repeat. That plays through once and they start a new section right at the end of there, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of moments like that where they'll kind of rip out a new riff that's just used as a transitional piece, just one playthrough straightforward, and then the new section starts.
Yeah, and yet what's cool is that, like, that is a big riff, Like, that's one of the most sort of dramatic kind of trem melodies on the song. I can't remember if they repeat that whole you know, they might play the riff again if they play the slam passage again. But they're not gonna like, that's not like the basis for some chorus part where they play that huge riff 8 times, right?
Yeah.
It's very much like, signals an extreme confidence. It's sort of like, we've got more riffs where this came from. We don't need to play it again.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I really like the sort of, you know, as a guy that's listening to a lot of this style, some of the sort of uniquely Japanese idiosyncrasies, like that weird little thing. That's a.
Are you talking about the breakdown at the beginning?
Yeah. That's a very kind of vomit remnants kind of technique. Actually, this whole passage.
That's the thing I was calling. That's the thing I was calling springy. Yeah. The only thing I can immediately reminds me of in death metal is would be some of the weirder breakdowns on None So Vile that you've played, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say
have this sort of bizarre elastic rubber band quality to them, right?
Yeah, there's a certain cryptopsy vibe to this, which is also cryptopsy is another thing that's important to Japanese brutal death. Like Vomit Remnants is one of the only bands I've seen do cryptopsy covers on a regular basis, so I think that was pretty influential of the style. So following immediately after your section is kind of the back half of this song, Expulsion of Foreigners, and I want to point out that it's very easy to get caught up in like the really cool hardcore parts of this record, and yeah, I love those, but these guys are actually really good at just doing straight up death metal riffs, and you know, doing tremolo riffs in general, which honestly a lot of the riffs that they're playing on this are better than a lot of the trem riffs from its source material in kind of New York death metal meets hardcore.
Well, a lot of the trem riffs here are better than most of the trem riffs on the brutal death records you've played, man. Like, well, yeah. I mean, like, the Oscar Ortega stuff is really cool, but definitely being used in a different way. As far as, like, big metal, big Black Death trem riffs, like, things that sort of satisfy those kinds of conditions, these are all really pretty impressive.
Yeah, because they function like riffs in a way that they usually don't in brutal death.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, in some sense, this is more musically conservative, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just more legible in general. I mean,
it places an extreme emphasis on legibility.
There's like a lot of clarity to it. You know, it's interesting.
Even in the super loud production, you can hear the bass, and it's super loud in a way that casts everything into relief.
Well, it was interesting because, you know, somebody was saying in the YouTube comments, like, you know, it's not a great mix, but then, which I agreed with until I put on headphones, and then that changed it completely. Like,
it does sound better with headphones, although I don't know that that's the setting you listen to brutal death metal in, isn't it? Like when you're like, you know, lifting weights or, you know, I don't know.
I do a lot of it while just like playing with my cats at home or playing video games and stuff. So. Well, I just listen to it all the time. So.
That's true.
Anyway, so let's listen.
I just love the idea of putting it on intentionally to play with your cats.
Oh yeah, it's like, oh, well, Wilkins is feeling frisky. Better throw on this digested flesh record so I can really get in the mood. All right, so Expulsion of Foreigners back half, and just listen to this really nice sequence of tremolo riffs, and then I'll try and talk a little bit about where I think some of the melodic ideas are coming from. I didn't even realize until now that on my sample there, they bring back the springy breakdown. Then there's a quick little interrupter riff, and then they do a tremolo version of that same breakdown, but with an augmented back half, which is really cool. Like, there's some really sophisticated songwriting stuff on here that only reveals itself after a few listens.
Yeah, this band hasn't released a record since 2009. And I think it's safe to say they've been in the dojo the whole time, right? This is extremely accomplished music. Nobody stopped listening to brutal death metal in that interval. Right?
Oh yeah,
or stopped playing, or just to death metal in general. I mean, they probably also listen to black metal.
Yeah, I can see that. These guys probably have big record collections.
For sure,
big Japanese metalhead record collections.
Yes, the characteristic completism, right?
It's a specific kind of metal autism you find in Japan.
Yeah, it's a sort of it's a disciplined attitude toward it. It's like, okay, I like metal, I need to know about metal, and what are the sort of honored classics that you need to know and understand, right?
I think it's one of the guys from Abigail that has one of the most insane collections I've ever
seen.
It's
the punks are like that too. Like they, like you read interviews with them. I've said this on the show before, but different listeners. You read interviews with like a Japanese D beat band, like noisecore D beat in like Maximum Rock and Roll or whatever, and they will talk with a kind of like a reverence for the elder bands in the scene. And things like that. Like
a sort of formalist sincerity.
Exactly. Absolutely none of the posturing that Western bands do about like, we just get drunk, don't give a fuck, we just, we just banged it out. Yeah, I guess we all like Discharge, right? Absolutely none of that. Just sort of like, serious. And the Finns are like that too.
Mm-hmm.
That like that band we were talking about last week, Reign of Terror, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so this is clearly coming from deep cuts. At the end of it, they did a thing that I want to highlight on. Do you have more to say about that? Because I've got a thing that can segue it, but I want to wait for you to finish what you say.
Oh no, yeah, you can go ahead.
So at the end of that, they introduced this mosh riff, sort of this kind of, like melodic slam or something, jum jum dum da da dum 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 jum dum dum. I missed a few notes in that because it's complicated, but jum dum dum dang 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 dang. And each time they repeat it, they like do a fill in between it. Like each time they finish that phrase or a run of that phrase, they have another a riff that they stick in between. And each time the riff in between is different. So you get like 4 repetitions of the basic phrase with 4 different riffs filling in the middle of each one. And all those extra riffs, the sort of like interstitial riffs, the in-between riffs, each time they're different. And each time they perform the same function, even though they're different. Right?
Yeah.
So and then at the end they tie it off with one of these extra sort of coda riffs that's like that. So we're dealing with like, we talk on the show, I think we try to sort of support bands who seriously listen to classical music in the way that extreme metal people are supposed to, but rarely do. This band really does. More so than many more bands that sound more kind of romantic or symphonic or have melodies that sound 19th century, right?
Yeah.
This is like, it's not just a general idea of those sounds or those ways of structuring things. Like, these guys could probably sit down and like, just like play some Bach on guitar or something, right?
Yeah.
It's and so yeah, it's really impressive. And so we're gonna go to the second to last track, Dead List, which is I think this might have the climax. I mean, clearly, Expulsion of Foreigners is a big track, but this might have like the climax moment to the record. We're going towards this like massive melodic section where you're gonna hear all these iterations of the melody with these different riffs filling in the middle, and how they all kind of these filler the additional riffs all kind of do the same thing different ways. And yeah, other than that, just to lead in, just listen for the vocals. I would suggest yelling "victory" is always a good strategy. So there's this idea there that something like da 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 da, and then every time they finish, this is even within the phrase itself. Every time they finish it, they finish it differently, and each iteration of the riff, they're playing it with each time they run through that little cycle, they're playing it with a different way of approaching it rhythmically. It's crazy. And so they get probably like 8 or 16 reps out of that in like a way that is sort of black metal levels of powerful melody repeated, but with continuous variation throughout it. Right?
Yeah.
And that's really, really impressive. I mean, the guys from Into Oblivion would find this interesting compositionally, at least.
Well, yeah, these are not songs written riff by riff. They're based around distinct sort of structural arcs, but the thing is, the immediate riff to riff stuff is so good that a lot of the time you won't even realize it. But careful listening allows you to dig out all these intricacies that really set this apart.
Yeah, that last thing was basically a riff palace, kind of like what we were talking about with Lotus of Darkness last week.
Yeah.
It was this. You enter as soon as there's a drop out, the blasts kick in, and then you enter this big structure that they sort of think of. They have the idea of 1 or 2 basic motifs, and then they just build this massive thing out of it, and you can't pick out like the riff, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, because it's not. There are riffs, but the purpose is not to find your favorite riff.
Exactly. Yeah.
The purpose is the entire structure and how it unfolds.
Yeah, and also in terms of like the tangent about record collections and whatnot, that is a very good example of like, you can hear the Japanese folk quality in the riff, and you can hear that it sounds very black metal. And some of the basic rhythmic outline of that is you could hear it in. It's a little bit like Marduk. It's a little bit like any kind of any of the more. It's a little like Scythian, honestly. Any of the more sort of morbid, angelly war metal, or also just impiety. Right, the good impiety.
How's it going? Connor here from Oncology, and you're listening to Terminus.
And we are back with the new one from Gallows, the UK-based pop hardcore band who took 2006 by storm. Just kidding, it's black metal.
When we were recording, I was doing my lead, and it was like, "Hold on, let me do this one. I've got a great one for it." And it's like some insanely deep cut shit that nobody who listens to this show is gonna know what you're.
Well, it's no. The funny thing is, we have a lot of sort of punk to metal pipeline people, and they'll probably remember Gallows. It was in that weird era where like. It was in that weird last gasp of the music industry era where like alt music was trying to figure out what the next big thing was, so you could put out something weirdly extreme and the press would flog it. So like Gallows had a lot of like screaming and it wasn't really screamo or metalcore. It was something more like Refused, but like poppy. Like, so it was literally like pop hardcore, but like to anyone who was normal, it would have sounded atrocious.
It sounds pretty miserable the way you're describing it. But...
Oh no, I don't think it's good music. No, no, it's pretty bad. It was clear, it's like music designed for teenage boys, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Shonen hardcore.
When I call things sort of like bright, shiny plastic sounding. Mm-hmm. Or like neon sounding. That's what it was like.
Okay.
Yeah.
But this is an unrelated Gallows. This one coming from Salem, Massachusetts, with their inaugural record 66 Black Wings, which I guess makes 33 bats, which is like that's like a lot of bats, but it's not really like a swarm of bats. Like if I went into a cave and there were 33 bats, I'd be like, well, that's a lot of bats, but I wouldn't leave immediately, That was my bit.
Well, that was your intro. Okay, that was pretty good too.
Okay, so Gallows first release period from these guys on Katafalque, which we assume is probably their own imprint or a buddy's. How do we describe this? So something we've been coming back to on the show a lot lately is some of the ideas of 2000s extreme metal returning in very strange ways, because this strikes me as a record from like 2005 2006 in the way that like this most closely resembles sort of normative black metal from that time, which is to say it's second wave worshipping, but it's further down the road. It's a little bit more codified in terms of technique. Which is not to say these guys don't have a personality. They absolutely do, and that's one of the things that makes this really interesting. But a lot of these riff types we haven't really heard in 15 years.
Yeah, and there's also a question as to, like, whether we even heard a lot of them back in the day. Because, like... Well, you know what? Also, you were listening to black and death metal in 2005 or 6, right? Whereas I was not. So but like, from when I became tuned into that stuff, which was probably 07, increasing after that pretty rapidly, there was tons of Dark Throne, right? Obviously the names that are going to come up are like Dark Throne and Mayhem, right? Mm-hmm. And there was tons of Dark Throne stuff, but it all sounded like Transylvanian Hunger. We've talked about that on the show.
Yeah.
At least the most overtly Dark Throne sounding stuff. This sounds very, very much like Dark Throne, but it sounds like Under Funeral Moon.
It does, and it's interesting because it resembles Under a Funeral Moon in the most salient ways, but there's also these little things that give it away as like it could not have been done before the last few years.
I agree. And after the first couple statement tracks, they sort of open up the style more and more. Even after the first track, the first track is very much like an Under the Funeral Moon track, which I'll talk about. But like, there's a range of sounds in there, all of which are drawn thoroughly from the 90s and like early 90s. But they get a wide range of stuff. Yeah. Well, so what's a good comparison for you from that early 2000s era then?
I mean, honestly, the big one that I came up with that I know you're also a fan of is the band Avsky, who almost nobody talks about anymore.
I think some of their stuff has recently been reissued, probably by Helter Skelter, which is one of the only good major label-based things out there.
Yeah, for those who weren't around for it, although Avsky is still an active band, and actually it has a full lineup now. Yes. Avsky's
really? Have they put out new material?
I think a few years ago they did their last record.
All right.
So Avsky started in... it started in 2002. First demo was only in 2006. And then I remember their first album, Mass Destruction, which was in 2007. Actually, looking up on Metal Archives, it looks like they have not done a record since 2010, but they are still listed as active. So who knows?
I think we're due for a comeback, would be my guess.
I'll take an Avsky comeback. That's cool.
Oh, hell yeah.
So Avsky was a two-man project from Sweden that is a sort of perfect summation of where black metal was in the mid-2000s. It's a rigorous and very well-executed interpretation of, I want to make a black metal record and it is 2005. How do I do that? Well, you do it in the way Avsky does. You have a lot of mayhem and a lot of dark throne. And it's a two-man project, so you're kind of streamlining these ideas and making them a little bit more minimal than they might have been with a full lineup. You're concentrating on big kind of like In the Shadow of the Horns bangers alongside gloomier kind of trem passages. It's very well-rounded, but still very distinct to its time.
Avsky was very oriented. I mean, I mostly remember them for one song, which is Fuck Your Values, Fuck Your Beliefs, right? But they were very oriented towards sort of like bulldozer mid-tempo black metal. Not in the sense of modern. It was stompy, but not generically related at all to modern stompy black metal.
You can imagine an equivalent to a degree that people would know better would be something like Craft.
I was going to say, yeah, it's in the same... The Craft and Catharsis has survived to still be canonical, which is ironic because they were not very good. Catharsis with a K, right? Catharsis was good at being very loud, but Catharsis and Craft were the two better-known variants of this.
Yeah. So what Gallows does is they basically bring that style back, this sort of liminal space between the second wave and modern black metal, but it features almost no overtures towards like truly modern, like very melodic, very streamlined black metal. It's got clunk to it that
sorry, my brain is still on the last thing real quick, which is I think a way to characterize what this specific constellation of bands you're talking about is like, right? Because they're not the orthodox bands, they're not the DSBM bands. It's something like, how do we make very traditionalistic black metal in the early 2000s when you associate a lot of the most standout features of the Norwegian scene, like grandiose melody or folk influence or whatever, where you associate those distinguishing qualities with trash late 90s prog black and sort of commercial versions of this, right? So that's the era of black metal where, say, even a band like Satanic Warmaster, who is, extremely poppy in a good way, but like Satanic Warmaster would boast about having no keyboards, right? People would be like, people all over would put out records saying like, no keyboards, no female vocals, no pussy shit. And so if you were trying to do like real underground black metal in specifically the Norse tradition, you would do like Darkthrone and Mayhem with a big sort of underlying sensibility of the kind of punk that metalheads like.
Yeah, I can see that. No, I think. Well, actually, here's a good example. How do you do black metal with no keyboards and no pussy shit, etc., etc.? Well, you do it by doing a song called "Blood Spells to Forest Speed," which is a song title that means nothing, but you know exactly what it means as soon as you hear it. So let's just listen to the opening of this track, because it's a fucking banger. Yeah, man. Blood spells to forest speed. I like that he yells it a couple times during the cool riff, which is all of them.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got a weird conceit about this record, which is like that this is what happens when you do a simulacrum correctly that actually produces something good rather than like a shell of something. Because these don't sound like Darkthrone riffs, they sound like the memory of Darkthrone riffs. You know what I mean?
A little bit. That might be, my brain isn't firing. I told you, my brain is not firing tonight, so I might not have picked up on that. I think I just picked up on the riffs that are loud, and that I like. But so you might want to explain that to your listeners, because I just heard riff.
So we all have an idea of how Darkthrone riffs sound. And, you know, through listening to them over the years and through listening to a bunch of other black metal bands, it kind of congeals not into specific riffs, but a memory of a feel of a kind of riff.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And this is kind of what happens when a band takes that memory and that feel and rigorously pursues it to try and make it sharper than the sort of foggy thing that's in their head. So what you get is stuff that's kind of like Under a Funeral...
I like that, yeah.
Yeah, so they're doing something... It's kind of like Under a Funeral Moon, but you hear weird angles in the intervals they choose that you wouldn't hear actually on Under a Funeral Moon.
Well, that fanned-out bar chord on some of those things is not a Darkthrone thing. That's, if anything, it's a Mayhem thing, but what it really is an Orthodox thing that would have been big in the early 2000s.
Yeah, there's these little hints of modern accoutrements. Like on the very first riff, you get that little second guitar arpeggio flare at the end of the riff, which is not something that Dark Throne would have done at all. Mayhem, maybe, kind of, but not with a riff like that. We're talking about this. We're talking about the simulated memory of old school black metal, and then what happens when you just pursue that really seriously and almost deliberately don't go back to check your work. You know what I mean? Well, you get something really interesting, and I think that's what you get here. And there's
like
other
playing a game of telephone on purpose.
Yes, exactly. And then additionally, there's certain stuff that's legitimately old school that's basically been sanded off of modern black metal. Like, when it drops from that thrash beat into that lumbering 6/8 section with the bell.
Yeah, that's fucking sick.
Yeah, it's great, and it's great because it's so janky. Because it's so weird and immediate, and there's no effort made to transition between these ideas at all. It just drops in the way that, Under a Funeral Moon, like Crossing the Triangle of Flames, the way some of those riffs drop in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're supposed to have this jarring effect they're supposed to be really heavy transitions, and it's a kind of thing that people don't do now.
Oh yeah, because it's not sweet enough,
Well, yeah. It also involves it's a hardcore-y thing, but it's a thing you can only do if you're a metal band, because it requires, say, the ability to go from playing 160 BPM to like 50.
Yeah,
instantly, right? But yeah, so yeah, man, I love that title. It just encapsulates everything I love about the second wave kind of vibe. You're supposed to be running through the forest with ill intent. And so, apropos of that, I just love the first song on this record. I think my favorite is the second song, which I'll say something about, but like, Roots Twisted in Sixes, as soon as I heard this, I was like, hell yeah. This is a place where the reference, I think when I heard this song, it gave me an idea of this record that's a little bit different from how a lot of the rest of the songs actually sound. Like, to your point, yes, they don't actually, a lot of it doesn't really sound like Dark Throne, right? But this song in particular is like, shows really careful attention to it, to the point where I can basically tell you which riffs these are coming from. And it's based on these two riff types that recur throughout Under a Funeral Moon. You've got these sort of grinding power chord riff, and satanic speed metal riff.
Yeah.
And they recur in specifically in a few songs. So like, this is, I didn't even put a timestamp on this, but I think we can just crank it from the beginning. And they take these kind of basic riff forms and make them seed ideas for things that are more complex in a way that, that's a sense of this being written now, is a sense of it being kind of late relative to its influences, is that there's this benefit of hindsight ability to use these basic techniques to write sort of more elaborate kind of riffs, not in a sort of unnecessarily frilly or kind of Baroque way, but just like going back intentionally to certain sounds, and using them to write kinds of riffs that bands today don't write at all. All right, so let's start on beginning of Roots Twisted in Sixes.
Amazing!
Alright, so it turns out that what I wanted to sample was the whole song. Yeah, started the sample a little too early. Basically, it's a very simple, simple structure. You get, there are two main riffs here. There's the sort of satanic speed metal riff that begins the track blasting and then rolls us out thrashing, right? Mm-hmm. Over one of those sort of like loping, slow down beats. Sort of deliberately slowed down kind of Slayer or hardcore beat, right? And that's drawing on these kinds of riffs that are on Under a Funeral Moon specifically. There's that 6 speed metal riff towards the end. And also blasted out on Diabolical Holocaust. Somewhere in the Diabolical Holocaust. I went back and checked this. And that is a kind of riff where I've complained about on this show nobody writing riffs like that in black metal anymore. These kind of riffs that sound a little bit like 80s destruction riffs, but like sort of without all the heavy metalisms, and much eerier. And so that riff sort of begins and ends the track. And then what's cool about that also is that there's an interesting rhythmic thing going on even there. The emphases are falling in different places from where you'd get them sort of conventionally in a thrash formatted riff, even as Dark Throne formatted them in this kind of thrash way. The emphases are like, they're taking advantage of this kind of swooping, diving sort of guitar format to add, to sort of give the riff this strange asymmetrical shape that has a lot of forward momentum. And they do like 3 bars of 4/4 and then I think 1 bar of 6/4 or something on that. So the whole, it allows them to create this sort of strangely shaped phrase. Then we get to a sort of more grinding blast riff, and that's more like unholy black metal and some of the ideas in Diabolical Holocaust too. And they give it on the Under a Funeral Moon, those riffs are very primal, right? Here they're given this sort of strangely snaky shape, right? And again, this is the sort of stuff that you can do with benefit of sort of Dark Throne didn't need to do anything to make these riffs weird, right? Or different, right? You're originating the style. You present their sort of most elemental form, right? So you can just do your sawing 2-chord riff on Unholy Black Metal or whatever, or you can just be drawing directly on the thrash tradition, right? This has that kind of ability to pick and choose what you want to do and think through, okay, how can we make something that works, say, more like a developing melody here or whatever. And I think that kind of stuff wasn't even happening that much in the early 2000s. That, to me, that attention, say, to like melody and form seems very last 5 years. Yeah,
there's very sophisticated stuff happening in the background of this that, it's like, this is one of those records where you can almost imagine them like trying to perfectly recreate a certain era of black metal, but there would be these little things that give it away. But in this case, it's just that's their style.
Yeah, for sure. They're taking advantage of the distance rather than, yeah. Also, just want to point out that the solo actually sounds like it's Ted.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that we haven't touched on yet, but I really want to talk about is the vocal performance on this record is awesome. It's old school and snarling, but it has this incredible theatrical quality to it that is just so awesome. You know, it's not just like cut to pattern vocal rhythms. They're these kind of they're these kind of weird declarations that kind of soar above the music that aren't really they don't just guide rhythmically the way metal vocals usually do, and I really appreciate that. So on the back half of this record, things open up a lot more. So the first handful of songs are really dedicated to kind of faithfully recreating the gnarliest parts of the second wave. But then a little bit more space comes to play on the back half. So I want to sample a track called Come and See, which is... Yeah, cool title.
No, that's a great title, but I'm also laughing to myself because I'm looking at a YouTube comment by somebody informing us, this sounds like Mayhem and Dark Throne. Metal horns, metal horns, metal horns.
That's what it's supposed to do.
Yes.
But actually, this song sounds more like Dark Throne and really early, like Vampires of Black Imperial Blood Mutilation, in the way that some of these just really strained, bizarre melodies come out. This might be my favorite track on the record. So let's listen to the ending of this one, because it's very cool.
The great fiery lake, their last enemy remains. And they will forever hunger, not divine or sure, and they will find no peace to the fear thirsting flesh, and they will find no rest. Their labor broken on their back, and they will sink again with no man to return to.
What? Keyboards? Death metal guy. Is this some pussy shit?
No, man, these keyboards are sick because it's an organ, bro. That's
That's
like the toughest kind of keyboard.
Obviously, that was fucking sick. That was great to pull that out at the end.
Oh, yeah. It's like, because it's weird because, like, keys are basically not used on the front half of the record, and then they start slowly creeping in on the back half. I'm starting to realize, like, every one of these songs has kind of, like, a weird sound object in it. Like, Blood Spell to 4 Speed is, it's got that big bell in it.
The first one has the solo.
Yeah. Yep, so there's, like, one little weirdo marker that means that it's from 2021 and not 96. So obviously vocal performance on this all over the fucking place. I love this like ranting vampire shit that he's doing. like a vampire that stubbed his toe really bad and is super pissed about it. Obviously, the way the organ comes in on the back there is amazing. And one thing that I really love, I love how obviously this is a hyper-talented guitarist slumming it really hard. You know, he's doing his best to restrict himself, but he can't hide how, like, hyper-crisp his, like, palm-muted little shuffle patterns are. In that mutilation, right? That dun 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 dun. It's like, dude, his right hand work is so perfectly on time. It's like there's no way that would have happened back in the '90s, dude. He's just too clean and too fast with it. But yeah, no, this is just an awesome song, and this is another record where I'm growing in affection for it the more we listen to it.
Yeah, this is pretty cool. I mean, you know, a band we should mention in connection to this is probably Gyndod, right?
Yeah, yeah. Coming from a very different angle, but yeah.
Yeah, again, this is more of an homage. Gyndod is more of trying to sort of continue the tradition, but, you know, Gyndod's a little more original, right? And higher level of the technique is more on full display there. But in terms of stuff that really nails made by people who really understand what was good about 90s black metal and don't just hear it under the sign of things that are contemporarily are things that are popular right now. Like there's I think a pretty strong connection. So yeah, as far as any concessions to, you know, modern stuff also, right? My last sample is going to start with this really sick blast riff, and this is really one of the only gestures towards the Dorian scale melodic sensibility that's big today, the more sort of noble or glorious sound. There are only a few. So actually, this really is one of the only one, might be the only one. But they're getting there entirely through ways that people would have played melodies like that in the 90s. You know, like Obtained Enslavement, since you haven't mentioned it yet, Immortal. You know, it's, and yeah, I brain farted there, but Immortal, yeah, this is just a very, very sick passage, and you can hear them engaged in strategic deployment of techniques that were banned under the Norway-Sweden Accords of 1993, and for which Immortal was placed under permanent economic sanctions, restricting Abbott's diet to cheap beer.
All right, we are back after some Avsky and a couple days because the power was knocked out in my apartment, derailing our first half of the episode. But
It's actually because Terminus got too satanic.
it actually got too devilish, and the Black Woodsman decided to extinguish all the lights for a while for me, or something like that. But for the concluding that dismal turn of events, we have an equally dismal record with the self-titled, I'm going to call it a full length because it's like 40 minutes long, by Thy Light.
Dude, by today's standards, that's a double LP.
Yeah, basically. Now, everyone's been listening to too much hardcore. Now like a full length is 19 minutes long. You still have to pay $16 for it at the merch table, though. All right, so Thy Light, I'm guessing this isn't a band that you have any familiarity with?
I've, only in the sense that at this point we have both seen the names of every metal band.
Okay. Fair enough.
I think I had a vague sense that this is probably DSBM. Not to be confused with Thy Dying Light, the excellent Judas Iscariot influenced British bashing noise black metal band.
Not at all. Very different. So, okay, so Thy Light is a project originally from Brazil, but relocated to Scotland a few years ago. It looks like Paolo, the main member, is actually doing live guitar for Sayor now. So he just kind of stumbled into this whole other scene when he decided to immigrate. So Thy Light started in 2007. That's when it's supposedly a demo, but it's really a full length, came out, called Suicide Depression. And 2007 was an interesting sort of turning point for DSBM, where the MySpace era was starting to fade out, as was DSBM in general. And Thy Light was one of the last, really big projects that's kind of universally lauded in terms of DSBM. The only thing that really came after it of equal import was probably Cold World or something like that. So Thy Light, Suicide Depression, comes out in 2007. I've been a huge fan. I heard it probably a month after it came out, and I immediately fell in love because I'm a big DSBM sad boy, and I was 17 at the time, so it was very important to me.
an even sadder boy.
And now I'm an even sadder 30-something boy. Oh, Jesus. Still listening to Thy Light. And what always defined Thy Light was, in many ways it is normative DSBM, but it was always a matter of degrees, where Paolo's execution of it was just so much better than his contemporaries. The riffs were minimal, but had an unusual harmonic color to them. The structuring was very smooth and organic, but still provided twists and turns that you didn't usually hear in that style of music. I believe Paolo has some background as a classically trained pianist, so sometimes you can hear some of his. Yeah, you can hear some of his piano work as interludes across his records. But I think that just informs everything he does. This is still very simple, very minimal music, but you can tell that there's shades of harmonic interest that are more from classical music than the standard idea of DSBM. It just gives everything a little bit more color and a little bit more richness.
His fancy keyboard arrangements are very much they're not really trying to be classical per se. They're very much grounded in the sort of gothy idea of classically influenced cinematic dark stuff. But they are they are fully plausible and enjoyable, pretty much on an equal footing with the other music.
Yeah, definitely. He's very good at weaving in those sort of dark neoclassical or ambient ideas alongside the metallic stuff, and he really takes that to a new level on this record. But I've given enough background as a guy who is sort of like brutal death metal, slowly getting exposed to more and more DSBM on this show. What do you think of this one?
Yeah, I think I like it pretty well. I would say that, like, certainly none of the individual riffs particularly grab me. Of course, that's not really the point of this music, and it's not really the most... I'm increasingly thinking that that's not really the point about anything, right? When, as I move increasingly towards anti-riff, certainly, like, this is supposed to be more than the sum of its parts music, and it is. Very sort of... I like the atmosphere here better than some DSBM, so there's some kinds of stuff that I think for you is, like, the real hard shit that I can sort of, like, respect, but I can't really go there. So, like, something like, that really sort of disorienting one that we recorded a review when you were catastrophically depressed, and you talked about Mortician for 20 minutes.
That was Negative or Nothing.
Yeah, so that shit is, like, I get it, but it's like, that's sort of like the stuff that's disorienting or deliberately hysterical or unhinged. It's, it's like, okay, I see this. It's not really a mood that's for me. This is definitely a lot closer to moods that I like. It's, it's pretty dour all the way through, but it also has this very, I guess the thing that I like about it is that it rejects some of the... On the one hand, it's much closer to depressive black metal than, like, the fully DSBM hysteria model. On the other hand, it's got the kind of... It's got a kind of very gothic, romantic fullness to it, and a sort of gloomy atmosphere, melancholy, without also, like, the emo elements that have crept in, or the post-black elements that have crept in.
It's stoically sad.
It's very stoically sad, and I think in some ways it can maybe be a little bit, its particular mode of Downcast isn't quite mine, but I think... So it's hard to say whether I'll come back to it, but I definitely, like, enjoyed listening to it, and can, I think I listened through the tracks a couple times for the show. So, I mean, overall, I'd say I approve of this, and it's definitely skillfully done, and I appreciate I appreciate that he's doing a very old school kind of song structures, which have way more to do with, they harken back, well, if you go far back enough to the second wave, but as far as the era of DSBM, sort of monolithic block structures, like the age of, like Vigrid stuff, or whatever.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, Vigrid is definitely I didn't even think of that, but that's a very good point of reference for this music, because these songs...
I only vaguely remember it as, like, Burzum successfully processed into more melodic DSBM, and it was good.
Yeah, no, that's basically correct.
Yeah.
Because, and something you say about, the monolithic block structure, there's two tracks on this record. They're 19 and 17 minutes long. And this fundamentally can't be listened to like a regular black or death metal song, because the time scales that Paolo is operating within are so elongated. This is supposed to sit in the background of your mind a little bit. You're not really supposed to catch when the transitions happen, what I mean?
Oh yeah, like something like what did you play for me? Nyctalgia, right? Nyctalgia you can, like, rock out to. Or Life Lover you can even sort of rock out to in a sort of rolling around on your floor kind of way, right? But like but like this is certainly not rock out music. It's also, I've got a good sample for that. Would you mind if I lead off? Oh wait, actually that's the order we have anyway. So there's a thing that I occasionally talk about on the show, but just because, and I think we got to it in a pretty interesting way when we were talking about that awesome the Sviatogor record. Who was the band again?
Devilgroth.
We got to it a bit, talking about the way that Devilgroth is sort of billions of riffs in one riff. But like, you know, I have this fixation on the idea of like the infinite riff, right? The sort of the riff that can be repeated as many times as you want, right? Which has to do with this elemental looping back on itself quality. It sort of it drives things forward while continually resetting. And that you get fewer nowadays bands doing that because the music is so actively riffy. And because also if you want to write certain kinds of big fancy riffs, you need to turn them around into other kinds, right? So it usually works best with certain kinds of extremely minimal styles. So this guy nails the infinite riff. And Infinite Stars Thereof, at least the first part of it, you know, because these are really long, sort of is basically built around that, or takes off from there. And this is a good example, sort of what you say about you're not supposed to necessarily notice the transitions, so keep that in mind when you listen. And keep that in mind that this riff has already been rolling for quite a while when I bring this in.
Yeah, I think that's notable in terms of DSBM because it's an actual black metal riff.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, that's like, I mean, yeah, that's like a 90s riff.
Yeah, this is much more closely tied to second wave than most DSBM. I mean, the whole DSBM guitar style, like the normative sound, isn't really black metal. It's Catatonia's Brave.
Yeah, you're right. It's
like a few Burzum songs, and later on like some Bethlehem or Silencer, and then later on just kind of like straight eighth note emo chords played
I think
very somberly.
various kinds of goth, some of which blends into the emo chords.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. No, that makes sense to me. So yeah, definitely very selective listening to Burzum.
Yeah, well, because it's like Philosophem, The Crying Orc, and like whatever random third one you pick is what your band sounds like, you know?
Yeah. It's like the it's the songs that everyone associates with Berzumic black metal, which is not really how Burzum sounds. Like, people talk about, like, oh man, I just want to listen to Burzum and sort of drift away into those sort of like lush.
They always forget about those parts of Burzum.
Yeah, like Jesus Todd, you know, which is the big jam on Philosophem and could basically be a Watain song. I've always wanted to like that. I've always wanted to hear some stadium black metal band cover that.
That would be pretty cool.
Yeah, because it's got, anyway. So back to this, right? That's a real black metal riff. There are variations over it with leads and really good, nice use of the keys. But none of the leads are like a At no point does the leads are all less important than the underlying riff. If anything, they just mirror the basic structure of the riff, but kind of in reverse, like as an ascent. And it's in this kind of, you know, thin post-rocky guitar style that I can take or leave, but is a fixture of the style, right? You get some glistening leads, right? But the point is, those are all there less to be like, oh, the rhythm part is the steady constant, and you should listen to these leads. They're more to just create this steady sense of development or change over the rhythm part to give him an excuse to keep repeating the rhythm part.
Yeah. It's just the leads and the keys. They just kind of like swoop in momentarily to provide a little bit of differing texture, you know. But the core of it really is just that hypnotic, repetitive riff.
Yeah, and then you know we get like 2 iterations of a different sort of melodic structure, not really a riff, but and in a regular song that would function as the chorus, or if we are trying to be extreme metal and not verse chorusy, we put that in scare quotes and throw some extra riffs in around it, right? But right, we get this sort of brighter gesture towards major key stuff. That sounds more how DSBM has gone, and also a little more post-rocky.
Yeah.
You get, like, the ascending lead part almost sounds like Sour or something. I can't say I'm a fan of Sour. In this context, I like it better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of what happened to DSBM as a whole, is, you know, its whole technical vocabulary got subsumed into post-black stuff. So that's one of the things that... That's one of the things that makes this interesting, is that it clearly would have appeal to those kinds of people, but you're never going to confuse this for, like, a post-black band. It's just, its objectives are clearly different.
Yeah, for sure. And, like, listening again, like, if you really pick out that sort of glistening lead post-rocky thing, or post-blacky thing, it's quite, the lead there has more character than it does over the Infinite riff. Like, It's you know, it's got a melodic quality. It could almost be a bit chameleon-y too. But like, and you know, the chording under it is nice. It's a really nice sort of break in the song. But if you're just listening to it continually, that will whiz by. And then bam, even that part just exists to get you back to the Infinite riff.
Oh yeah. I like that a lot. All right, so a little bit further into this track, on Infinite Stars Thereof. So here's the big climax part of the song. And one thing that I really like about Paolo is that Paolo is actually this remarkably talented musician, you know, outstanding pianist, outstanding guitar player, but he never shows it until he does. Like, all of the stuff on this record is very simple to play until it's not. So here's a big DSBM climax with a face-melting DSBM solo.
All right.
the way that solo's arranged. It has so many distinct movements to it, where he's playing around with different stylistic ideas. You know, you've got this wonderful, almost kind of bluesy opening that moves into this more technical modern metal thing, and then we're dropping back into just Swedish twin guitar theatrics. You know, I'm not a big solo guy, but I love it when it's very arranged like that.
It sounds kind of like Van Halen, but in a good way.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. There's different phrases.
Or like
Yngwie
Malmsteen. Van Halen is not, of course, known for being terribly melodic. Maybe Yngwie style shred or whatever, right?
Yeah. Just slowed down a little bit, tempered slightly, but ultimately, yeah, it's reaching back to guitar theatrics from the 70s and 80s, which is, sort of where the heart of the solo lies. So it makes sense.
It's weird, yeah. It's weird how well he fits that in. I get it. Somehow makes sense that would be there. It wouldn't be totally out of the question for a gothic doom band to do, but it is like surprising and in a good way. When you started that sample, I thought by solo you meant just the kind of more standard lead stuff that was happening at the beginning of it, and I was like, this is fine, this is not that great. And then, then it's like, oh shit, the face melting solos at the end.
Yeah, man. Well, it's I think the reason it works, even as like melodramatic as some of those phrases are, is just because it's so earned. I mean, the solo starts 15 minutes into the song.
Yeah.
Basically, as it trails off, so it manages to earn its sort of crazy sugary stuff, and it actually has impact because it's been such a journey to get there. I think there's a lot of things that, there's a lot of weird stuff like that can be incorporated into metal. It just needs to be developed toward properly,
Yeah, it also works well in DSBM because in DSBM there's a kind of individualistic element to it. You're dealing with someone's feelings, right? And it's often a one-man project. That doesn't mean you don't distance from that individuality in a variety of ways. Like this project is clearly he's not up his own ass. But the idea of like that kind of soloing, right, is a little bit like, not all soloing works like this, right? But like, especially in extreme metal, right? Like Euronymous solos don't. But like that kind of expressive, kind of still blues, heavy metal inflected soloing is very much like, here is me as a musician, and it kind of fits the idea of a melancholy bard that you find in some, hunched over in some corner of Dark Souls 3, right? And he's just he's letting his feelings pour forth, right?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so first track, like I said, there's 2 tracks on this record, so I mean they're just these enormous, kind of monolithic, sorrowful things. First track, really
Sonic Cenotaphs.
Ooh, that's a good one. We'll put that on the sticker on the cover of the vinyl reissue in a couple years. Yeah. But for me, it's all about the second track, called The Crossing of the Great White Bear, which is an amazing song title, and I love that it's for a DSBM band. It inspires so many thoughts when you think about that in the musical context.
Yeah, for sure.
So one thing that I like about this record, which it's almost silly to say because it's DSBM and it's the goal, it's like, oh, this actually makes me feel sad. This actually makes me feel depressed because at this point, all of these techniques have been so fully incorporated into stuff that's much more polished and kind of less emotionally messy. Like Post Black, which is Post Black's about a lot of the same things but very cleaned up. You're supposed to have good hair while you cry.
And it's supposed to lead. Yeah, and also it is. I think Post Black is sort of emotional and individualistic in a similar way, but like And it also wants to offer you a certain kind of solace, but DSBM offers you it's supposed to offer you a pretty kind of bleak solace, right? Whereas post-black often comes to you with this sort of consoling image of sentimental nature and I mean, a lot of it at this point just sounds like nice. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, it just sounds it sounds nice, but without any of the dark underpinnings that make that shit acceptable for extreme metal.
Yeah, without any of the undercurrent of intensity or the sense of challenge. Yeah.
So the Crossing of the Great White Bear, it begins with this very long, very languid piano-driven passage, which is just fucking outstanding. It's some of Paolo's best piano work. But then when it kicks in, I swear to God, I had, when the main riff of this song kicked in, I had a fucking Ratatouille moment, where I went back to being 17, listening to Suicide Depression, in my room, staring out the window when it was raining and shit, and just being, so emotionally fucking dead. And this takes me right back there, but in a good way. It's it's nice to be able to access those feelings, every now and then. But man, when this main riff comes in after a few minutes of just beautiful somber piano stuff, it's just a sledgehammer onto the psyche. It's so fucking cool. The best DSBM, even though it's, ostensibly music sort of about human weakness, the best DSBM always has this undercurrent of strength. Even if it's just in terms of, its finality and its conclusiveness, this is very strong DSBM.
I feel that for sure.
Yeah, this isn't effete and complaining. This is I've reached a conclusion about the nature of existence, and this is what it is. You know, it's
Yeah, I think it also sort of, this is a place where it starts to open up more from the personal. As you were saying, a conclusion about the nature of existence.
Yeah, because, I mean, Thy Light has always been, I mean, like, lyrically it's very personal, but the music has always kind of gestured towards something broader. You know, a sort of refined sensibility of impending doom, you know, and an acceptance of it. I mean, like, the best DSBM is all like that. Like, Total Self-Hatred is absolutely like that, or Make a Change, Kill Yourself is like that. Yeah, no, this is...
So I mean, you would say that even if you're not listening to it as a extremely depressed person, or like it kind of has a role of reconciling you to death and loss?
It's more that a good DSBM record should be that guy on the horse next to the Roman Emperor returning from battle to whisper, "Remember you are mortal," into his ear. You know, I think that's the role of DSBM.
I like that a lot. Yeah, that's a great image. I forgot. I think I've heard that story, but I forgot it. So thank you.
I mean, it might be apocryphal, but it's still it's good. It's good apocryphal.
Yeah. So I mean, but in terms of musical power, I mean, there's another thing that has sort of bled into DSBM and post-black, right, is like Slavic black metal, right?
Yes.
And if this is it's the same thing as with as we were talking about before. Like, if you attempt to listen to Autumn Aurora by Druid in the kind of way that you might listen to some of the music inspired by it, it's just this sort of like benevolent pastoral kind of thing, it will consistently frustrate your expectations, in part because it's based around sort of gigantic, deliberately slowed down, massive chord strums like that, right?
Yeah.
You can hear him lowering the tempo just shy of expectation. You can hear the, physicality in the playing, which you also get in the solo. And they're just really good chords. There's like, at no point, you know what this record is? It is completely unfussed about what's original or isn't.
Oh yeah, no, I mean that main riff is it's basically a standard DSBM riff. I mean that riff has probably almost to the note been played numerous times before.
But it's a very good version of it. There are these well-placed little places where it will lower or change something on the higher strings in a way that just makes it really gives it that kind of weight of finality.
Yeah, and a lot of it also has to do with the other arrangement decisions, like the bass, how it's just playing like kind of whole notes, just kind of hanging out in very kind of post-punk way, where it's like it's not there to do the same thing as a guitar. You know, it's used more as a rhythmic instrument, and also the
in post-punk, pardon the pedantry, but in post-punk, what's often going on is that the bass takes the role of the guitar. Classically in Joy Division.
But there's also times where it takes a backseat and it has this sort of glassy kind of pointillistic role.
Yeah, I get what you mean. And I mean, I think also it's fair to say that it is like relative to the role of the bass in black metal, where it's often just cloning the guitar line. Then yes, certainly post-punk bass gives a role to the bass that you can hear, that matters more and that is more rhythmic. I think that's totally fair.
And also worthy of mention is the drumming. I'm pretty sure these are programmed drums. I think they always have been, but these are very, very carefully programmed drums. Like, to an almost excruciating level where it might be easier to just record it with a drummer. Like, all those very quiet ghost notes on the snare that have been painstakingly velocity mapped and plugged in there. It adds a real richness to the rhythmic section of music that can usually just be very static in that regard.
Other thing about it not being sort of static is like the classic MySpace DSBM song, when the arpeggios pick up, right, the arpeggios would follow exactly the outline of the chords before them. It would just be, here now is the broken version. In fact, the phrase he plays with the arpeggios is, I think, longer, maybe twice as long, and it just, the roots are different. And the rhythms are different. Yeah.
Yeah, that's like a...
and it's equally crushing. That's another cool thing. Rare and important black metal quality. Switch to the arpeggio. Switch to this sort of... switch to the arpeggios and have it sound like digging in rather than going sort of atmospheric.
Yeah. That's probably a good idea in general.
Mm-hmm. So, last sort of, I guess, related to what you were saying about the bass. Bass doing whole note stuff, and that sort of deliberately slowed down tempo. This sounds to a thing that seems to be happening now, and maybe it's also just because we've got kind of these early 90s bands on our mind lately, but like, the thing that seems to be happening now with DSBM is like a convergence between that and Peaceville Gothic Death Doom or the more romantic Funeral Doom stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, we heard that we heard that in a very different way on that Gravkvada record from last year.
Mm-hmm.
Right, which was very forbidding to music. That was basically structured like black metal, but the entire sensibility was like the bleakest Funeral Doom. Right.
Yeah.
And this is much slower and less aggressive than that music in some ways, but it's equally sort of like muscular, and there's especially when he gets to the big arrange. I mean, that the rhythmic sensibility in that whole passage you just played would fit very well with the sort of Gothic Doom thing. You know, it's similar ideas melodically to just the classic stuff like Sear Me or whatever by My Dying Bride. And when he goes to the sort of more orchestrated, arranged stuff that he's quite good at, then it really starts to sound like those kinds of albums. So this track, the end of this track is interesting. So it's we're gonna get I sampled a metal part, but the interesting thing about the end of this track, right? So this is like how many? This picks up basically almost right after your sample ends.
Yeah,
like
like
50 seconds. Yeah. So and we get more metal stuff here, but just structurally we go back into atmospheric stuff, then big metal climax for like 2 or 3 minutes max, and then just back to atmospheric stuff, and that's the whole rest of the track. So, but here you'll definitely get a sense of that sort of like heavy death doom, goth doom vibe here. Love that little bass lift there at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think...
That's
and
like
it's
a
also
country
interesting.
thing.
Well, yeah, and you also start to hear the... when you hear the arpeggiated part in isolation on the acoustic like that, you start to realize, oh, it's kind of... The root notes are kind of a sad, like, Celtic folk melody.
Yeah,
You know?
it's. I think that would be a better way of describing it.
Well, I mean, they're deeply interrelated. You know, I mean, and a lot of the ideas that are kind of bluesy or kind of folky across this record are all connecting with this root of sort of European folk music, which is, I feel like, something that used to be very common in DSBM back in the day, but kind of got forgotten.
That's probably true. Like Vigord's a good example of that.
Yeah, it's I feel like the root of all this was sort of like folk melodies, just the saddest possible folk melodies. But then it kind of got, it got distilled down into these are the sad chords. And this is a guy that doesn't agree that the sad chords are limited to those.
Yeah, so there's a kind of... I think the overall sensibility is more Celtic for sure, but there's something about the way, even just the particular style of arrangement there, too, that, like, connects it to, like, just alt-country stuff. Like, I'm thinking, like Woven Hand or 16 Horsepower or something.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But, so I think what I really... Yeah. But, certainly the ba-wom, that is very much also sort of Celtic drone stuff. But yeah, so before that, now that we've talked about the two notes for 2 minutes, before that we had that solo was just outstanding, right?
That leads one of the best things on the record.
And that's closer to wailing bagpipes or something, or a fiddle. That's much more of a kind of folk rooted black or doom metal solo than the one before, and it's equally awesome, and it's based on this, maybe I like it even better, and it's based on this very patient phrasing that's like more melodically structured.
Yeah, it really is very deeply smart music, without ever being flashy or without ever notifying the listener that this is very smart. There's a lot of ways you can listen to this. You can listen to it very intensely, or you can listen to it as an atmospheric piece, and it really excels in both.
Yeah, he wears his talent lightly, which is always the best way to do it. You might have some things to wrap up, but I also want to quickly draw attention to the YouTube comments, which are good. Okay. This guy has a very very loyal fan base, and some of it's interesting. So best comment is from Hasibul Hassan. In my country, it's raining outside, and you guys released those beautiful tracks. I don't know how to give you thanks for the perfection. Just take love from Bangladesh. Heart emoji. Up above, we've got Chotu Kumar says, fantastic. Thy Light doesn't even know how many fans in India they got. Love your band. Amazing musicians. Heart emoji. Hell the Black Metal Nerd replies, another Indian Thy Light fan? So this has like a following in India and Bangladesh, and then get all sorts of, of course, like, people from his native Brazil and all that, but everyone's really stoked that this came out again, or that he's released music again, because it's been a while, right?
Yeah, it's been about 8 years since the last record. Yeah.
So yeah, people are excited, and I guess that's all I wanted to communicate.
Hi, this is Taylor from Crushing the Scepter, and you're listening to Terminus Podcast.
And we are back from after the depressive black metal of Thy Light with some highly melancholy, if not quite as depressive metal, by Hanging Garden from Finland. This is Skeleton Lake, out on Lifeforce Records, although the band also has their own Bandcamp set up. But full nice editions of every medium on Lifeforce. Skeleton Lake, I will say, also has one of the coolest covers I've seen this year. Just beautiful landscape painting of a sort of still Finnish harbor in the middle of winter. So what is Hanging Garden? Well, this is a band I discovered back in like 2017 with the album I Am Become. I missed one in between to the 2019s, Into That Good Night. This band is ridiculously prolific. Since 2013, they have put out a record every 2 years on like clockwork. And it's a large lineup band too. I'm sure members rotate to some degree, but this is like a 5+ person band at all times. This could only be achieved in Finland, basically. Keeping a lineup that big, coherent for that long. That wasn't even when they started. Like they took a 4-year break before that in 2013, and then they did 2 other records before that, 2 years apart. So this is very prolific band, and I think they're one of those bands that keeps changing shape little by little over time as they explore different sounds. But the basic concept is something like, I guess Gothic Death Doom. But you can tell they're drawing on all sorts of other music. I think they said they were into like stuff like Cult of Luna. You can hear bits of various kinds of modern hardcore, post-hardcoreisms creeping in, shit like Amon-Ra or whatever. But the core of it is certainly like Northern European death doom. I would say that I Am Become was a lot like every era of Catatonia at once. Sort of like some extremely intense death metal parts that are kind of, the word seamless at this point is a cliche, but seamlessly blended in a surprising way with these kind of almost playful kind of gothy parts. And it had this really unique mood. So the band also, for some context, the band is named after the most kind of exuberant song on The Cure's Pornography, The Hanging Garden. The Pornography is known as The Cure's bleakest and most insane album. But like The Hanging Garden is kind of a banger. And the other weird thing about I Am Become was that even though it was sort of very, very dark, it was sort of it was not really it didn't have the despairing, it didn't have the sort of like either crushing despair quality of early Catatonia or the kind of just like more sort of like embracing kind of indulgence and depression that the later Rocky stuff has. It had this kind of exuberance. It had all the sort of sensual quality of The Cure, which was pretty much always in all of their music. Very different from a lot of the other goth bands. You could describe it as highly corset oriented, but with the sword close at hand, just in case, right? There were some moments where it would just, really cool kind of fantasy lyrics too, moments where they just go full throttle. So I really liked that record. I was interested to see how they've changed. This works all in that general, they have such an expansive concept that this is still in the ballpark of The Hanging Garden, but it's changed a lot. Back in the day, they had female vocals they had a lot of really good male cleans in addition to growls, and some clean, female vocals showing up once in a while. Now that's become a fixture of the band, and it's basically this is the leading melody thing throughout the record and the leading vocal form. And I don't think I've heard this much female vocals on like a relevant underground metal record in, over a decade.
Yeah. No, all the various accoutrements that that would cause a lot of people to dismiss this band out of hand are some of the best things about it, actually.
Yeah, it's, we talked on the last show, I think, about, or earlier this show, maybe, I don't know, last fucking time we talked, about,
no keyboards, no female vocals.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, we were talking about Gallows, a couple days ago.
Yeah, how there was this reactive moment against, understandable reaction against things that people associated with Dimmu Borgir and whatever, but that were, a baby was thrown out with the bathwater, right?
Definitely.
In terms of, and so this band is swimming to the bottom of the frozen lake to reclaim the baby and thaw it out with their strangely warming ice magic. So what did you make of it, bro? Yeah.
This is an interesting one. This is obviously outside of my usual wheelhouse, but it's still very good. It's basically objectively extremely good music. To me, it feels like the big idea here is Hanging Garden is trying to make a concrete idea of a band out of all these sort of liminal Peaceville records as all those doom death bands were transitioning into more of a goth rock direction. Mm-hmm. But pretty much all of those bands had one or two records where they were making that transition. And there's a lot of good material on those records, but they always feel a little bit uncertain of themselves. They're playing around with ideas, trying to figure out how to pull it off exactly. Hanging Garden is trying to create a foundation with that stuff. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And they pull it off. They envision a world where the transition stops halfway through, the Pokemon evolution gets canceled, and it kind of proceeds from there. This sort of dark, doomy, occasionally very heavy, but also very delicate style of music. But you don't really hear it anywhere apart from, Peaceville records from like 95 to 97. And actually, one of the things I found surprising about this is I feel like in most cases where bands are doing that kind of blended style, they tend to be best when they're moving in the softer direction. Like, in a lot of these cases, I feel like if it's a band blending doom death and goth rock, usually they're at their best doing goth rock.
Yeah, it's sort of like, use the doom death for punctuation and to keep things grounded, but basically, like, the weakness of some of those transitional styles can be like, don't pretend you're still a death metal band.
Yeah. But in Hanging Garden's case, the really heavy stuff is actually so good, I wish there was more of it.
That's how I feel about this one, too.
Yeah, this is about, like, between, like, heavy and soft stuff, this is probably, like, a 30-70 split, and I wish it was more 50-50. Because
it was more like that on the record I was telling you about. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the softer stuff is excellent. Like you were saying, all the vocals are fucking phenomenal. The clean male and female, and the death growls, they're all excellent. But damn, like, they can really rip out true old school doom death riffs here and there, and I kind of want to hear more of it. And that's a style that I wasn't even that into on kind of those seminal records of the early 90s. So, yeah, no, I think this is a really cool album, and I definitely want to go back into the catalog after hearing this one.
Yeah, and my guess is this band has so many records in them that, it's entirely possible that one or two records from now, they'll put out something that sounds like, the frosty, folky version of Brave Murder Day or whatever, right?
Yeah, which they're pretty close to already on this.
Yeah, in some ways, yeah. So let's check it out. This is I'm glad you like it. So let's go to the very beginning of the record. This is the song Kura. Yeah, Kura.
There you go. It is extremely surprising me because I looked this up to check it out, that the woman doing the clean vocals on this record, at least according to Metal Archives, hasn't done any other records. At least no other metal records, which is very difficult to believe because she's absurdly talented.
Well, she's probably, yeah, it's probably the Kari Ruslaten thing, right? Where it's like, this is like a folk, classically trained or sort of classical or folk singer doing, you know, well, there's not the same stigma against metal in Scandinavia, right? So you can have somebody who's just like, you can be a classically trained musician and do things like that in traditional music, and then, like, you know, you listen to some metal from time to time, and, you know, then someone's like, hey, I want to be on our metal record, and you're like, yeah, hell yeah.
Yeah, no, it's like, and while it was playing, it was like, this shouldn't be fucking cool. Yeah. Like, this should not work, but it does.
The initial moment where, like, there's a great riff, which I'm going to talk about in a second, but then there's that, like, dropout, and the female vocals come in, and you're like, it's like the parts of, like, big poppy kind of folk metal things that, like, I'll hear and I'll feel upset at myself for liking. Because, like, you know, because it's like they ding the bell and you drool, and it's like, yeah, fuck, I like elves. You know, right? But, like, here it's everything that sort of simulates, this just does, right? It's extremely epic. It's sort of, the vocals are soaring and beautiful. The chord changes under it are not just sort of filler epic. They're extremely powerful. And it just gives you that, it also gives you that immediate sort of sugar rush that the more guilty pleasure stuff does too.
Yeah. And, well, I mean, I think what makes it work is that this is not, you know, there's a version of this that is completely chilled out, you know, but this has this strident, metallic quality even at its softest moments, the same sort of propulsiveness that makes it a lot more interesting to listen to. You know, that sort of windswept glacier vibe. I mean, it's like the guys are just walking, but they're walking in a really extreme and very cool environment. You know, so it keeps those metal kicks even at its softest moments.
Yeah, I'd say that this is a great place where they nail that. Yeah, that's something I wanted to talk about. It's like an undertone on this record that I didn't hear so much on the last one. The last one, there really were moments where it seems like these lyrics are about Vikings and battles and shit. But, like in certain moments in the songs, it would get very, you know, very like that. But there wasn't any Bathory influence. This album often feels like epic Bathory. This part in particular, like, rhythmically, it's hitting exactly the tempo and exactly the kind of 3 against 4 thing that you'd get on even one of the Nordland records that you love.
I was thinking Nordland is definitely the Bathory point this accesses the most.
And so it's like the architecture, the architecture sonically is very, very different. But, like, underneath that, in terms of the rhythm section work, I bet they said, dude, let's do a Bathory. And you get a fair amount of that at different points on this record. And I think that's where they get those moments where they generate all this drive from a kind of majestic, open, mid-tempo thing are some of the best.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, no, it's like I said, there's ways to do this stuff that blends softer styles of rock music or, you know, what have you with extreme metal. And I think these guys have a much better idea of how to pull that off, which is, you know, to keep to realize that metal, or even extreme metal, is not just about really extreme riffs or something like that. It's about these subtle undercurrents of mood and structure and everything. So this is, in a way, these are kind of like goth rock songs structured like extreme metal songs.
I think that's fair, yes. The extreme metal survives as framework, basically.
And
also,
it's the whole framing device that makes this make sense.
Which is almost the opposite of what usually happens with the less successful bands, where they become structurally goth, modern goth rock, and incorporate some, like, extreme metal garnish, and often there's so much of it that it's, like, superficial. Right.
Yeah, they're stuffing in black metal riffs into places where structurally they lose all coherence.
Yeah, and so with something like this is also like a thing that the last album, even though it was more aggressive, did well, and that this also does well, is that you never get a moment where it's like the aggressive part sort of kills the vibe.
Yeah.
Right. Also, real quick about that riff. Right? Really great phrasing on that. You hear like the first little phrase is sort of developed in the second, and then the third phrase, that like slide down, is echoes part of the second phrase. So it's got a really lovely sort of shape to it. Also, that cool kind of dissonant that dissonant slide in there. You were saying, I mean, I love it, and you get some of that sort of ancient folk semitone vibe there, and maybe also a bit of rock and roll. But, like, you said that reminded you of something.
Dude, I think I've heard that exact melodic pattern on something before, but it's totally escaping me. I almost want to say it might be like a later Tiamat song or something like that.
Ooh, that is a very Tiamat thing. I actually wanted to mention that in connection with this band. More so the last record than this, but Wild Honey is, I think, huge for this band.
Wild Honey's going to be huge for this band. Later Anathema is going to be huge for this band.
Even that, like, even the sense, though, that there's, like, this, it's very kind of northern metal sounding, but still kind of greasy. That's very Tiamat. Like, I've gone back and listened to. I've been really enjoying the back catalog. I went back to it recently, and they have that one that comes out right before Wild Honey. That's like, it's still definitely extreme metal.
Is that Clouds?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, they're deliberately using thrash riffing, in a way that is. There are actually a couple really good ones from before that. The one right before Clouds, the Astral Sleep, is very death metal-y, but they're like sort of reacting against everyone else by using thrash riffs. And even then, it already has the Tiamat atmosphere, you know.
Definitely. Okay, so goth rocky stuff. Here's a really fun part. This is off the opening of Nowhere Haven, and we're gonna have the riff from Catatonia's Brave. And it's going to linger for a long time, but these guys are really good at playing with texture to juice as much as they can out of these kind of, like, standard elemental riffs. And it's also got a very fun, jangly tambourine in it, which is just going to put a smile on your face as soon as you hear it. You like that little jingle jangle from the tambourine there?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, I like to think that they gave it to the female vocalist so she could Stevie Nicks.
Yes, pure Stevie Nicks energy right there.
This might be one of those records where if you interviewed them, they would just be like, "Yeah, we were listening to a lot of Fleetwood Mac."
I could see that. I mean, it's got that vibe, but that's basically the Brave riff, right? Or it's like there's a kind of
It's
riff.
definitely one that's on that album or on the October Tide album. It's very characteristic of in that moment.
Well, I'm kind of curious, because like we were just talking about with I Light, the Brave riff is an entire riff archetype. Were they the first ones to do it?
I think, yeah, there might be one of those weird timing things where even though Katatonia is the first band, October Tide technically does it first, but they're almost the same band in terms of like who's doing the songwriting.
Yeah.
Brave Murder Day is 96. Let's see. Jonas Renske was an October Tide. Rain Without End is 97. So yeah, Katatonia does it first.
Yeah, it's funny how not a lot of people talk about that, but that riff, I mean, that's a riff as important as like the main Transylvanian Hunger riff in terms of its repercussions across metal guitar technique.
That's true. It's just got, it really isn't. You can tell it's coming from certain things, right? You can trace it to various sources, more like in goth and like, goth rock and maybe death doom stuff than black metal. But like, it's also got black metal repetitiveness, and it's got this sort of immediately satisfying, just kind of like sullen rock vibe. That, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of music in this style that isn't great, but that's more the fault of the bands. Like, I mean, that is intrinsically, that is a good example of a riff that has a sort of visceral, sentimental quality to it and is just undeniable, right? It's awesome.
Yeah, no, it's a classic riff pattern, so I don't have any problem with people biting it, and they do a really good version of it because they keep spicing it up with these little micro variations that keep providing more and more texture. And then in that middle break before it returns, you've got a wonderful interchanging vocal section between the harsh vocals, the male cleans, and the female cleans. It's just really rich and really keeps your interest even as it gets so much softer. Because I was thinking, when you hear it, you think, oh, you've got this very rich melodic thing. Maybe they're going to go to something just like a little bit stompier, a little bit more minimal and distilled from there. Kind of like just breaking it down into palm-muted chords or something.
Oh, yeah.
But no, drop out completely, make it super delicate, so when the riff pops back in, it has that outsized effect. It's just really, really smart kind of traditional pop in a good way songwriting.
Yeah. And all being used in a kind of more... Yes, and the extreme metal format gives them the ability to like do these big pop gestures in a more sort of varied way within each song than you'd ever get on a more like poppy metal record, right?
I think that's correct. I think it's that lingering real extreme metal influence that allows them to play with these ideas and make them way more exciting.
You know what it is? You know what it's like? It's like almost like they're doing. It's like if you have a sort of pop metal song, right? Because that's usually what we mean when we say pop, right? It will turn around one of those big dramatic moments, maybe two if you're lucky, right? But that's basically the whole sort of hook principle. And this is a 4-minute and 31-second song, and within that sample you did, which is about a minute and a half, right? We get like 2+ really big dramatic moments.
Yeah, it's just they really compress these things down. They give you the effect of a 12-minute My Dying Bride song in 4.
That's true too. Yeah, and they're like, here's the parts that are the center of this music. So let's like actually emphasize them.
Yeah. So my next sample, this is coming towards the end of the album. This is off Road of Bones. And again, we've got a wonderful a wonderful part from the female vocalist on this, which actually reminds me a lot of like Cradle of Filth circa Nymphetamine in terms of the tone and the arrangements for her. Nymphetamine, not a good album, but outstanding vocal performance from Sarah Jezebel Deva. But this is also going to be an example where you're going to hear some of the heavier stuff, and I just wish it hung on a little bit longer. Because, you know, these guys are so good at doing these striking, surprisingly heavy moments. I just wish they'd dedicate a little bit more time on the record to it.
All right.
Yeah, so that's a part where it's like it's equal parts joy and frustration because I like all those parts a lot. You know, I mean, that's like, again, talk about the kind of compressed nature of this record. That's like 4 kind of distinct passages in just over a minute. But this is a case where I think a little bit more repetition or a little bit more just hanging on to those heavy parts is really good because I love the way they develop that heavy riff, and then it's such a cool passage. I wish we just kind of stuck on it for another 4 bars or something, or you know, we augmented it a couple times, you know, with some additional textures before we drop into that very soft section, which again feels harsh to say because that soft section afterwards is so fucking cool, and you know, it's a really awesome thing. I just Maybe these songs are almost too compressed at times. Maybe they should be like 6 minutes long.
They'd still have way more. They'd still have way more exciting parts than, you know, at either end of the spectrum, right?
Yeah, it's like they would still be doing more than the 12-minute My Dying Bride song, but it's like all of these ideas would have a little bit more room to breathe, and then I think they'd be even more effective.
The other thing that's fascinating about this band, I guess we've sort of touched on it, but like they're constantly inverting what is supposed to be the heavy part. Or like, so during the heavy part with the vocals, there's no chugga chugga. You don't even get a sawing catatonia riff, right? They're not the kind of hammering guitar chords, right? The guitar is doing a kind of it's not delicate really, but it's doing these sort of glassy sliding chords underneath with a pretty beautiful melody, right? That sort of balances against the screaming, and it has the rhythmic quality makes it have the feeling of a, you know, death metal breakdown, right? But all the real power is coming from the rhythm section, core, and the screaming. And the melody has this kind of power through lightness thing, kind of like on Dying Light, where, you know, he's doing the arpeggio. This band has, like, similar to the Dying Light, you get, like, arpeggio moments that are really heavy. There are arpeggiated second guitar parts that crop out throughout this and that are awesome. And they're not grabbing center stage. They're just there. If you listen, you'll hear them.
Yeah, no, I think that's the thing is, like, these guys are so good at arraying these textures and, well, I mean, and obviously they went to an extremely expensive studio because the way all these little aspects are tucked into the mix is extremely high level, like unattainable for most metal bands probably, but yeah, I can't get away from the sense that certain tracks and certain moments on this are so good. I wish they would just get a little bit more towards extreme metal and like the kind of stridently repetitive quality of extreme metal. I think that maybe these guys are a little bit too hooked on these. They can pull off these awesome dramatic shifts.
Oh,
and
you know what it is? Oh, I see where you're going. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, so they know how good they are at it, so they build songs around those shifts. But their moment-to-moment riffing is so fucking good, you could have at least some songs or some passages that are more built around that as a centerpiece, and I think it would only make this music greater.
Yes, they are drunk with power.
They're drunk with power on the loud soft dynamic that was supposed to be totally done as of 10 years ago. But these guys are somehow making it cool again.
Other thing, just quick note about the male vocals, which are like just male cleans, and people are finally figuring out how to do them in metal over the last in extreme metal over the last 5 years maybe, which is basically like everyone acknowledged that Ison's cleans actually kind of sucked and were only cool because it was Emperor. And like, and that is not like the starting point you want to start from, and just sort of, you know, rip it up and start from some more interesting point, like something in goth music or in rock and roll or in neo-folky stuff or whatever, right? Or just heavy metal singing. The vocals here just they're so good. They're like, they're extremely sort of, you know, it's sort of, it's that kind of flamboyant masculinity vibe, right? Like I think like the persona in these vocals is, you know, maybe more so on the last record, but on this one too, it's this kind of like, he's like seducing a maiden, but in a kind of wholesome way.
Yeah,
you know, he's like romancing. He's like an elf romancing a human girl or something. And he's like, "Come away with me to my magical world of dark delights," right? And
but also, I'm not sure who's going to take care of the farm.
Exactly. And he's like, "Don't worry, here's a pony." Like here, you know, it's like, you know, yeah, or like he magically makes gold appear in her parents, like you know, in the butter churn. Right.
This is a little oddly specific black metal, guy.
Dude, I'm
a daydream you've had.
It was my last hinge date. But
the app was not deleted.
But yeah, no, it's a cool persona, you know. It's kind of like Robert Smith, but you know, not as like wimpy. It kind of reminds me of the persona of classic era Davey Havok in AFI. He had this kind of just like, gotta tell you, babe, just putting it out there, right? All right, so Field of Reeds. This is there are my notes literally say several cool transitions here. So I guess we've already touched on that. But let's just listen to it. It's cool.
Distant shores far away.
dude, yeah. I think that's my pick for heaviest moment on the record.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, you get this, I mean, just one thing to another, man. But, like, yeah, that idea, you take the, you just take, like, a classic good Melodeath riff, you stretch it out, kind of like Catatonia and October Tide did, and you put it over this, like, Bathory strut, and everything, like, there are, like, 6 different drops, almost all at once, but sort of layered. You get the fucking, like, sort of wildly gyrating bagpipe line, but it's buried in the back, and then you get these other keys over it. It's also like the folkiest moment on this record. It really taps into that drone, and they also, here's a moment where you get the repetition you wanted.
Yeah. It does. That one sticks a little bit harder because they play around this core idea. No, that's really awesome.
And then they go to another heavy part. They're just like, okay, we did the heavy part. Now here's the soft heavy part with, like, the Catatonia arpeggio and the screaming, right?
Yeah. So, then we'll do the heavy soft part and the soft part.
Exactly.
One thing worthy of mention, and this is a little bit of a shot in the dark. I kind of assume that it has to be true. I'm guessing a lot of this music has to do with, like, transitional era amorphous, like Elegy or Tuonela, which honestly I'm just not very well versed in. But I'm guessing they're countrymen who ended up doing something very similar to this. So I'm guessing that's probably a big part of this record's DNA.
That is probably true, and that's something that's a blind spot for me as well. Man, though, I tell you, I keep trying to go back to Tales from the Thousand Lakes. Like, it's like unlistenable to me. Like,
really?
Yeah, there's like some stuff, you know, I like folky pagan stuff, even to the point, but, like, you know, like the keyboards are, the keyboards date really hard. I would love to not say that, but it's like they're like all over the place. But the general idea, I wonder if Amorphous gets better as they get into those transitional albums.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I checked it out. Maybe that's what I'll do. Maybe I'll do some amorphous listening just to shore up some of my blind spots there.
But I feel like those kind of rippling folk melody lines in there were kind of like what Amorphous was trying to get at. So I can hear that for sure.
Yeah. Is this the oh, we've really come full circle, because the other softest record we've had on the show was probably that Paradise Lost record we covered on our first episode, and now we're kind of winding our way back towards where we started.
Oh, we're like Ouroboros licking his own butt.
nothing, for you will be ruled by an iron hand. And somewhere, the master shows his face. A grand design of vintage wealth, sail on wings of golden pride, a blindness that will free your mind to carry the seed for the years ahead.